The dust kicked up from Tex McCready's horse as he rode into Cedar Falls that September morning in 1882. His weathered face showed the lines of a man who had spent 32 years fighting the wind, sun, and everything else the frontier could throw at him. The town wasn't much to look at, just a handful of wooden buildings scattered along what folks generously called Main Street. But Tex wasn't here for sightseeing. His ranch hands had been after him for months about getting married. "Boss, you need a woman to cook and keep house?" they'd say over their evening beans. "Winter's coming, and we can't keep living on burnt biscuits and whatever we can shoot." Tex had finally given in, not because he wanted a wife, but because he needed help. Running a cattle ranch alone was wearing him down, and he was practical enough to know it. The marriage bureau sat between the general store and the saloon, marked by a simple wooden sign that read "Brides Available, Inquire Within." Tex tied his horse to the hitching post and walked inside, his spurs jangling with each step. The place smelled of ink and desperation, with papers scattered across a small desk where a thin man in a rumpled suit sat writing. "You hear about a bride?" the clerk asked without looking up. "Got some fine ladies, all proper and ready to marry. Most are young, some can cook, and a few even know their letters." Tex nodded and waited as the man shuffled through his papers. "Let's see here. We got Mary Patterson, she's 20 and sweet as honey. Then there's Ruth Williams, good with children and makes fine pies. Oh, and there's Elizabeth Carter, pretty as a picture and comes from a good family back east. Any of them available?" Tex asked, pulling out his worn wallet. The clerk's face fell a bit. "Well, that's the thing. Mary got claimed yesterday by a farmer from the next county. Ruth married a shopkeeper last week, and Elizabeth ... Well, she picked a banker from town just this morning." Tex felt his jaw tighten. He'd ridden 30 miles for nothing. "So you got nobody?" "Well," the clerk said slowly, "there is one left. But I gotta warn you, she's been passed over 3 times now. The men who met her said she wasn't quite what they expected." "What's wrong with her?" The clerk shifted in his chair. "Name's Margaret O'Sullivan, but she goes by Maggie. She's 28, which some say is getting on in years for marrying. Irish, came over about 5 years ago. Been working as a seamstress and taking and washing to make ends meet." Tex waited for the rest. There had to be more. "She's got a mouth on her," the clerk continued. "Speaks her mind, doesn't back down when men try to tell her what to do. The last fellow who came to meet her said she was too bold, asking questions about where she'd live and what her duties would be. Can you imagine?" Actually, Tex could imagine. He dealt with plenty of stubborn cattle and horses in his time. Maybe a woman with some backbone wouldn't be the worst thing. "She healthy? Can she work?" "Oh, she can work all right. Been supporting herself just fine. But her hands aren't soft like a lady's should be, and she's got opinions about things that maybe she shouldn't." Tex thought about his leaking roof, his scattered cattle, and the long winter ahead. He needed someone who could work, not someone who'd faint at the sight of blood or refuse to get her hands dirty. "Where is she?" The clerk pointed toward the back room. "She's in there, mending some curtains for the hotel. Fair warning, she might ask you questions too." Tex walked to the back room and found a woman sitting by the window, working on a piece of fabric. Her red hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her green eyes looked up at him with interest rather than the shy downcast gaze he'd expected. She was pretty enough, though not in the delicate way most men seem to want. Her face had character. A strong jaw, expressive eyebrows, and a direct gaze that made him feel like she was sizing him up just as much as he was sizing her up. "You must be the rancher," she said, setting down her sewing. "Mr. McCready, Tex McCready. And you're Maggie O'Sullivan." "That's right." She stood up, and he noticed she was taller than he'd expected, maybe 5.5 feet. "I suppose they told you I'm the one nobody wants?" Her directness caught him off guard. Most women would have been offended or embarrassed, but she said, "It like it was just a fact, nothing more." "They mentioned you'd been passed over 3 times, she said with a slight smile. "Apparently I ask too many questions and have too many opinions for most men's taste. So tell me, Mr. McCready, what makes you different from the others?" Now it was his turn to be direct. I need a wife who can work. My ranch is 30 miles from here, and it's not easy living. I need someone to help with cooking, cleaning, and anything else that needs doing. I'm not looking for a decoration or someone who'll faint at the sight of hard work. Maggie nodded slowly. And what would I get in return? Besides the honor of being your unpaid worker? Her tone had an edge to it, but Tex found himself almost admiring her spirit. A roof over your head, food on the table, and my protection. It's not a love match, but it's honest work and honest pay. At least you're honest about it, she said. The last man who came to see me talked about cherishing and honoring, but when I asked about my role, it was clear he wanted a servant, not a partner. They stood there looking at each other for a moment, both weighing their options. Finally, Tex spoke. I won't lie to you, Miss O'Sullivan. I'm not easy to live with, and ranch life is hard. But I'll treat you fair, and I won't expect you to be something you're not. And I won't pretend to be a delicate flower, she replied. I've been working since I was 12, and I'm not afraid of hard work. But I won't be treated like property either. Fair enough? Tex extended his hand. Partners, then? She shook it, her grip firm and sure. Partners. The wedding took place an hour later in the small church at the end of Main Street. The preacher, a kind man named Reverend Collins, performed the ceremony with only the clerk and his wife as witnesses. Maggie wore her best dress, a simple blue one she'd made herself, and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers the preacher's wife had quickly gathered from her garden as they said their vows. Tex noticed that Maggie's voice was steady and clear. She wasn't nervous or weepy like he'd expected. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Tex shook her hand instead of kissing her. It seemed more appropriate for their arrangement. After the ceremony, they walked to the general store to buy supplies for the ranch. Tex watched as Maggie carefully selected practical items: flour, beans, salt, and fabric for mending. She asked the prices and calculated costs in her head, showing she knew the value of money. You'll need warmer clothes for winter, Tex said. Noticing her thin shawl, I can make what I need, she replied. No sense spending money we don't have to. As they loaded the supplies into his wagon, Tex found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Maggie O'Sullivan, now Maggie McCready, wasn't like any woman he'd ever met. She was direct, practical, and completely unafraid of him. Part of him respected that, but another part worried about what would happen when they got to the ranch, and had to figure out how to live together. The ride back to the ranch was quiet at first. Maggie sat beside him on the wagon seat, looking out at the vast prairie with interest rather than fear. Finally she spoke. Tell me about the ranch. What kind of condition is it in? Tex hesitated. He could lie and make it sound better than it was, but she'd see the truth soon enough. It needs work. The roof leaks, the barn needs repairs, and I've got cattle scattered across land that's not properly fenced. I've been managing alone for 3 years now since my partner died, and I'm behind on everything. How many cattle? About 200 head, though I lost some last winter to the cold and wolves. Maggie nodded thoughtfully. What about water? Good grazing? Her questions surprised him. Most women wouldn't know to ask about such things. There's a creek that runs through the property, and the grass is decent in most places. Why? Just trying to understand what I'm getting into, she said. I grew up on a farm in Ireland before the Troubles. Lost everything when the crops failed, and the landlord threw us out. That's why I came to America. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they finally reached the ranch. Tex watched Maggie's face as she took in the sight of the small cabin, the leaning barn, and the empty corral. Her expression didn't change, but he saw her eyes taking in every detail. It's got potential, she said finally. That's one way to put it. They unloaded the wagon in the growing darkness, and Tex showed her inside the cabin. It was small, just 2 rooms, a main room with a fireplace and table, and a smaller room with a bed. The furniture was rough but solid, made by hand over the years. I'll sleep out here, Tex said, pointing to the main room. You can have the bedroom. Maggie looked around the small space, taking in the dusty surfaces and the pile of unwashed dishes by the wash basin. We'll need to get this place cleaned. Up before winter. We? She turned to face him, and in the lamplight her green eyes seemed to shine. You said we were partners, didn't you? Partners work together. And so began the marriage of two people who had found each other not through love or romance, but through necessity and practical need. Neither knew what the future would bring, but both were determined to make the best of the bargain they'd struck. In the quiet of that first night, as they settled into their new life together, the morning sun was barely up when Maggie woke to the sound of rain dripping through the cabin roof. She lay still for a moment, listening to the steady plop, plop, plop of water hitting the floor in the main room. Through the thin walls she could hear Tex moving around, probably putting pots and pans under the worst leaks. She dressed quickly and stepped out of the bedroom to find him standing in the middle of the room, looking up at the ceiling with frustration written all over his face. 3 buckets and a wash basin were already catching the worst of it, but water was still finding new ways through the worn wooden shingles. "Good morning to you too," Maggie said, stepping around a puddle. Tex grunted without looking at her. "Coffee's on the stove. I'll be outside checking the animals." After he left, Maggie took a good look around the cabin in the gray morning light. Yesterday she'd been tired from the long wagon ride and the stress of getting married to a stranger. Today she could see just how much work this place really needed. The floor had gaps that let in cold air and probably mice. The windows needed new glass in 2 places where boards had been nailed over broken panes. And that was just what she could see without really trying. She made herself a cup of the strong coffee Tex had left on the stove and walked outside to get a better look at the ranch. The barn was worse than she'd thought, one whole side was, leaning like it might fall over in the next strong wind. The corral fence had gaps big enough for cattle to walk through, and there were tools scattered around the yard like they'd been dropped and forgotten. Tex was in the pasture beyond the barn, trying to get the cattle to move toward better grass. She could hear him shouting and see him waving his hat, but the animals seemed more interested in wandering wherever they pleased. Some were near the creek, others had spread out across the hillside, and a few were heading toward what looked like a neighbor's property. Maggie watched for a while, then went back inside to start breakfast. She found eggs from a few chickens that had made their home under the cabin's front steps, and there was bacon hanging in the small pantry. As she cooked, she thought about what she'd seen. The ranch had good bones, plenty of land, water, and grass, but it needed organization, repairs, and a lot of hard work. When Tex came in for breakfast, his mood hadn't improved. His clothes were muddy, and he had a scratch on his cheek from wrestling with a stubborn cow. "Cattle scattered again," he said, washing his hands in the basin. "Spent 2 hours getting them grouped up yesterday, and they're already spread out over half the county." Maggie set a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him. "Why don't you fence the pasture?" "Costs too much. Fencing wire's expensive, and I'd need miles of it." She sat down with her own plate. "What about using the natural boundaries? I saw some good spots yesterday where you could put up shorter fence lines to guide them where you want them to go." Tex looked at her like she'd suggested he teach the cows to dance. "I've been running cattle for 10 years. I know what I'm doing." "I'm sure you do. I just thought maybe you should stick to women's work and let me handle the ranch." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Maggie felt her cheeks get hot, but she kept her voice calm. "Yesterday you said we were partners in marriage. That doesn't mean you need to tell me how to manage my cattle." After breakfast, Tex went back outside, and Maggie started cleaning the cabin. As she worked, she thought about what he'd said. She'd grown up helping her father with their small farm in Ireland. She knew about animals and land management, maybe more than Tex gave her credit for. But clearly, he wasn't interested in her opinions. By noon, she'd swept, scrubbed, and organized the main room. The leaks were still dripping, but at least the buckets were catching most of the water. She was hanging wet clothes on a line behind the cabin when she heard shouting from the direction of the creek. Tex was standing knee-deep in the water, trying to pull a cow out of a muddy spot where she'd gotten stuck. The animal was panicking, thrashing around and making the situation worse. Maggie could see that the more Tex pulled on the rope, The deeper the cow was sinking, she ran toward the creek, calling out, "Stop pulling!" "You're making it worse. Stay back," Tex shouted. This is dangerous, but Maggie had dealt with stuck animals before. She waded into the water upstream from the cow, moving slowly and speaking in a calm voice. "Easy, girl, easy now." The cow's eyes were wild with fear, but she stopped thrashing when she heard Maggie's gentle tone. Maggie worked her way closer, avoiding the muddy spot, and got behind the animal. Instead of pulling from the front like Tex had been doing, she pushed from behind while making encouraging sounds. "Come on, darling. One step at a time, that's it." Slowly, the cow worked her way out of the mud and onto solid ground. She stood there shaking, but she was free. Tex stared at Maggie like he'd never seen her before. "How did you know to do that?" "Common sense," Maggie said, wringing water from her skirt. "Animals panic when you pull them. Sometimes you have to work with them, not against them." That afternoon, while Tex rode out to check on the cattle again, Maggie walked around the property. She found the spots she'd noticed from the wagon, places where natural rock formations and thick brush could be used to guide cattle movement with just a little bit of strategic fencing. She also noticed that the creek had washed out a small dam that would have created a better watering spot for the animals. When Tex came back for supper, she tried to bring up her ideas again. "I was thinking about that fence situation. If you put up just a short stretch of fencing over by those rocks. Maggie," his voice was tired, "I appreciate that you want to help, but I've got a system here. It may not look like much to you, but it works. Does it? Because from what I can see, you're spending most of your time chasing cattle that could be contained with a little planning." Tex's jaw tightened. "This ranch was running fine before you got here, was it?" "Because the roof leaks, the barn's falling down, and your cattle are scattered from here to the next county." They stared at each other across the small table. The coffee was getting cold between them, and outside, the wind was picking up, promising another stormy night. "I didn't ask for your advice," Tex said finally. "No, you asked for a wife who could work? But apparently that only means the kind of work you think is suitable for women." "That's not what I meant, isn't it?" Maggie stood up and started clearing the dishes. "You want someone to cook and clean and keep house, but heaven forbid she has an idea about anything else." The next morning brought news that made everything worse. Old Pete Hawkins, their nearest neighbor, rode over just after breakfast. He was a grizzled man in his 60s who'd been ranching in the area longer than anyone else. "Morning, Tex, and you must be the new missus." He touched his hat to Maggie. "Heard you two got hitched?" "News travels fast," Tex said. Pete nodded toward the hills. "Saw some of your cattle up near my north pasture yesterday. Thought you should know before they wander too far." Tex's face darkened. This was the third time this week his cattle had strayed onto neighboring land. "I'll get them moved." "Might want to think about fixing that fence line," Pete said casually. "Winter's coming and you don't want your herd scattered when the snow hits." After Pete left, Tex was in an even worse mood. He saddled his horse and rode out without saying a word to Maggie. She watched him go, then looked at the broken fence gate that had been bothering her since yesterday. It was hanging crooked on one hinge, held up by a piece of wire that looked ready to break. She found some tools in the barn and spent the morning fixing it properly. It wasn't difficult work, just a matter of realigning the hinges and replacing the broken wire with a stronger piece. When she was done, the gate swung smoothly and latched securely. Tex came back around noon, leading a group of wayward cattle. When he saw Maggie by the gate, his face got red. "What are you doing?" "Fixing the gate. It was barely hanging on." "I told you I'd get to it." "When?" "After the cattle wander off again. That's not your job. Then whose job is it?" Maggie's patience finally snapped. "Because it seems like nothing gets done around here except chasing cattle and complaining about problems that could be fixed with a little effort." Tex got off his horse and walked toward her. For a moment she thought he might be really angry, but when he spoke, his voice was more hurt than mad. "This is my ranch, Maggie. I've been making it work for 3 years on my own. Have you, though? Really?" She gestured around them. Because it looks to me like you've been barely surviving, not thriving. They stood there in the afternoon sun, both breathing hard. The cattle were milling around the corral, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. Finally, Pete's voice came back to both of them from that morning. You got a good mare, but you're treating her like a mule. That evening they ate supper in silence. The rain had started again, and the buckets were back out to catch the leaks. As Maggie washed the dishes, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Maybe she should have taken her chances in town, rather than coming out here to fight with a stubborn man who didn't want her help. But as she looked around the little cabin, she realized something. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged somewhere. October turned to November, and the first snow came earlier than anyone expected. Maggie woke up one morning to find white covering everything outside their cabin windows. The flakes were still falling thick and heavy, and the wind was howling like a wild animal around the corners of the house. "Tex?" she called, but got no answer. His blankets by the fireplace were empty, which meant he'd already gone out to check on the cattle. She pulled on her warmest dress and her father's old coat that she'd brought from Ireland, then stepped outside into the storm. The cold hit her like a punch to the chest. She could barely see 10 feet in front of her face, but she could hear Tex shouting somewhere near the barn. Following his voice, she found him trying to get the cattle into the shelter he'd built against the side of the building. The animals were confused and scared, bunching together, but not moving in any useful direction. "Get back inside," Tex yelled when he saw her. "This is no place for you." But Maggie could see he was fighting a losing battle. The cattle were panicking, and his shouting was only making them more nervous. She moved to the other side of the herd, speaking in the calm voice she'd used with the stuck cow weeks earlier. "Easy now, ladies. Come on, this way. Nice warm barn waiting for you." Between the two of them, they managed to get most of the cattle into the crude shelter, though it was clear the building wasn't really big enough for all of them. As they worked, Maggie noticed that Tex was breathing hard and moving slower than usual. Back in the cabin, they both stood by the fire trying to warm up. Tex's face was flushed, and when he started coughing, Maggie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "You feeling all right?" she asked. "Just cold," he said, but his voice sounded rough. The storm lasted 3 days. On the second day, Tex's cough got worse, and by the third day, he could barely get out of bed. His fever was so high that Maggie could feel the heat coming off him when she stood next to him. "I'm fine," he kept saying, even as his whole body shook with chills. "Just need to rest a bit." But Maggie knew pneumonia when she saw it. Her younger brother had died of it back in Ireland, and she recognized the signs: the deep, rattling cough, the fever that wouldn't break. The way Tex struggled to catch his breath, she made him as comfortable as she could in the bedroom, piling every blanket they owned on top of him. Then she went outside to face the storm alone. The cattle needed water, but the creek was starting to freeze. She broke the ice with an axe, her hands so cold inside her gloves that she could barely feel the handle. Some of the animals had gotten out of the shelter during the night, and she found them huddled against the cabin, covered in snow. Getting them back to the barn was like trying to solve a puzzle while wearing a blindfold. Every time she got a group moving in the right direction, others would wander off. Her feet were numb inside her boots, and the wind kept knocking her sideways, but she kept working. By the time she got back inside, she was exhausted and soaked through. Tex was awake, trying to sit up in bed. "The cattle ... he started to say. "Are fine," she told him, helping him lie back down. "I got them sorted. You can't. It's too dangerous. It's done, Tex. Rest now." She made him drink water mixed with honey and whiskey, the way her grandmother had taught her. She kept wet cloths on his forehead to bring down the fever. And every few hours, she went back outside to check on the animals. The storm finally ended on the 4th day, but Tex wasn't getting better. If anything, he seemed weaker. Maggie knew she should try to get help, but the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the snow was 3 feet deep in some places. She couldn't leave Tex alone, and she couldn't risk getting lost in the snow herself. So she did what she had to do. She kept the fire going. She melted snow for water. She fed the chickens and broke ice on the creek twice a day so the cattle could drink. She fixed a section of the barn roof that had blown off in the storm, standing on a ladder in the cold wind while snow fell around her at night. She sat by Tex's bed and listened to his labored breathing. Sometimes he talked in his sleep, calling out names she didn't recognize or mumbling about cattle prices and fence posts. During his clearest moments, he would try to give her instructions about the ranch. "The brown cow with the white face," he'd whisper. "She's close to calving. Watch. For her, I will. And the hay in the barn, save it for the worst storms. The cattle can graze if the snow's not too deep." "I know, Tex, I've got it handled." He'd look at her with eyes that were bright with fever. I should have listened." Save your strength." One night, about a week into his illness, Tex's fever broke. Maggie woke up in the chair beside his bed to find him looking at her with clear eyes for the first time in days. "Maggie?" "I'm here. How long have I been sick?" 8 days. He tried to sit up, then fell back against the pillows. "The ranch ... The cattle ... are fine. I've been taking care of everything." He stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "You've been running the ranch? Alone?" "It's not that complicated once you get the hang of it." But it had been complicated. Every day had brought new challenges. She'd found 2 calves that had gotten separated from their mothers during the storm and managed to reunite them. She'd repaired fence that had been damaged by falling tree branches. She'd even figured out a better way to distribute hay that kept the stronger cattle from bullying the weaker ones away from the food. As Tex slowly got stronger, he spent his days in bed watching through the window as Maggie worked outside. He saw her trudging through the snow to check on the animals, her red hair bright against the white landscape. He watched her fix things he'd been meaning to get to for months. He saw her working from sunrise to well past sunset, keeping his ranch running when he couldn't. "Why didn't you tell me you knew so much about ranching?" he asked one evening as she brought him soup. "You didn't want to hear it. I was wrong." She sat down in the chair beside his bed. "Yes, you were, I thought. I thought you were trying to take over. Tell me what to do on my own land." "I was trying to help. There's a difference." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind outside. Finally, Tex spoke again. "My father always said that asking for help was a sign of weakness, that a real man handled his problems alone. And how did that work out for him?" Tex managed a weak smile. "He died young, working himself to death on a farm that never made money. Maybe it's time to try a different way." Over the next few days, as Tex got stronger, they started really talking for the first time since their wedding. He told her about the 3 years he'd spent trying to run the ranch alone after his partner died, how he'd gotten further and further behind on repairs and improvements, how his pride had kept him from asking for help, even when he desperately needed it. Maggie told him about her family's farm in Ireland, and how her father had lost everything because he was too stubborn to try new methods of farming that might have saved their crops. She talked about the knowledge she'd gained working on other people's land after they lost their own farm. "I've been watching you work," Tex said. "The way you handled the cattle during the storm, the repairs you made to the barn. You know things I don't know, and you know things I don't know. That's why partnerships work better than going it alone." As November turned to December, Tex was finally well enough to go outside for short periods. The first time he walked out to check on the cattle with Maggie, he was amazed at what he saw. The animals were healthier and calmer than they'd been in months. The barn repairs were solid and well made. Even the hay was stored more efficiently than he'd ever managed. "You did all this while I was sick? We're partners, remember? Partners take care of each other." That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Tex looked at his wife, really looked at her for the first time since their wedding. Her hands were rough from hard work, but they were capable hands that had kept his ranch running when he couldn't. Her hair was simpler than the fancy styles town ladies wore, but it suited her practical nature. Her green eyes held intelligence and determination that he'd been too stubborn to see before. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me more than that." You owe me respect. You've got it. She studied his face, looking for signs that he really meant it. Do I? Or will you go back to treating me like hired help once you're feeling strong? Again, I was wrong, Maggie, about everything. You're not hired help, and you're not just someone nobody else wanted. You're the best thing that ever happened to this ranch. And to you? He was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. I'm starting to think you might be the best thing that ever happened to me, too. Outside, the wind was still blowing, and winter had a long way to go. But inside their small cabin, something had changed between them. The partnership they'd agreed to out of necessity was becoming something deeper, built on mutual respect and the knowledge that they were stronger together than either of them had ever been alone. Spring came early that year, melting the snow faster than anyone expected. By March, the creek was running high and fast, and green grass was already poking through the brown earth around the cabin. For the first time since their wedding, Tex and Maggie woke up to warm sunshine streaming through their windows instead of the gray cold of winter. Tex was finally back to full strength, but something fundamental had changed between them. Instead of heading out alone each morning to check the cattle, he would wait for Maggie to finish her breakfast and ask, "Ready to see what needs doing today?" And Maggie, instead of staying behind to tend only to household tasks, would grab her father's old hat and follow him. Outside to walk the property together, their first project was fixing the fence lines that had been damaged by falling trees during the winter storms. As they worked side by side, pulling broken posts and stringing new wire, they found themselves talking in ways they never had before. "I was thinking," Maggie said, holding a fence post steady while Tex hammered it into place, "what if we divided this big pasture into sections? Let the cattle graze one area while the grass grows back in another?" 6 months ago, Tex would have dismissed the idea without thinking. Now he paused and considered it. Rotation grazing. I've heard of it, but never tried it. My father did. It was sheep back home, said it kept the land healthier. Might work with cattle, too. We'd need more fencing, but if it means better grass. He looked at her with something that might have been admiration. How would you divide it? They spent the next hour walking the pasture, Maggie pointing out natural boundaries and explaining how she thought the rotation could work. Tex found himself genuinely interested in her ideas, asking questions and building on her suggestions. By April, they had implemented several of Maggie's improvements. The rotational grazing was working better than Tex had expected. The cattle were healthier, the grass was thicker, and he wasn't spending half his day chasing strays anymore, but the biggest change was in their daily routine. They worked together on everything now, from morning chores to evening planning. When Tex found a sick calf, he called for Maggie to help treat it. When Maggie wanted to plant a garden behind the cabin, Tex helped her prepare the soil and build a fence to keep the rabbits out. You know, old Pete Hawkins said one afternoon when he stopped by to check on them, "I've been ranching these parts for 30 years, and I ain't never seen a place improve so fast." He was sitting on their front porch, drinking coffee that Maggie had made, watching them work together to repair the barn door. "Maggie's got good ideas," Tex said, not even pausing in his work. "I can see that, but it's more than just ideas. You two work like you've been partners for years instead of months." After Pete left, Tex and Maggie sat on the porch steps watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The cattle were settled for the night, the evening chores were done, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Tex felt truly content. "Pete's right, you know," he said, "about us working well together." Maggie smiled, pulling her shawl closer against the evening breeze. "We make a good team. Better than good." Tex hesitated, then said what he'd been thinking for weeks. "I was wrong about you, Maggie, about everything. You already apologized for that? I'm not apologizing again. I'm saying thank you. For saving the ranch. For saving me, probably." She looked at him sideways. "You would have figured it out eventually." "No, I don't think I would have. I was too proud and too stubborn. Still am, probably, but at least now I know it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds around them. Finally, Maggie spoke. "I got a letter today." "Something." in her tone made Tex's stomach tighten. Oh, from my sister in Boston, the one who works for that wealthy family. Tex waited, not trusting himself to speak. She says they're looking for a housekeeper, someone to help manage their household staff. The pay would be good, and they'd give me my own room in their house. Maggie's voice was carefully neutral. She thinks it would be a good opportunity for me. Better than this place, Tex said quietly. She thinks so. A nice house in the city, steady wages, no hard labor. When would you go? Maggie turned to look at him fully. I haven't decided if I'm going at all. They looked at each other in the fading light, both thinking about the months that had passed since their wedding day. How much had changed between them? How much they'd built together. What do you want to do? Tex asked. I don't know. She was quiet for a moment. 6 months ago, I would have jumped at the chance. A way out of this marriage, a chance for independence. And now? Now, this feels like home. This ranch, this life we're building. She paused. But I need to know something, Tex. What? Do you want me to stay because you need help with the ranch, or because you want me here? It was a fair question, and Tex knew it deserved an honest answer. He thought about the months they'd spent. Working together, the way she made him laugh over breakfast, how much he looked forward to their evening talks on the porch. Both, he said finally. I do need your help with the ranch. But more than that, I want you here because I can't imagine this place without you in it. That's not the same as love. No, it's not. Tex took a deep breath, but it might be the beginning of it. Maggie was quiet for so long that Tex began to worry he'd said the wrong thing. Finally, she spoke. I need time to think about it. How much time? I don't know. The position in Boston won't be available for a few months anyway. Over the next few weeks, they didn't talk about the letter again, but it hung between them like a storm cloud. Tex found himself watching Maggie when she didn't know he was looking, trying to read her thoughts. Was she imagining herself in a fancy Boston house, wearing clean dresses and eating meals she didn't have to cook herself? Meanwhile, their ranch continued to thrive. The garden Maggie had planted was producing vegetables they could sell in town along with their surplus eggs. Her idea to breed their best mare with Pete's stallion had resulted in a foal that was already showing promise. Most importantly, their cattle herd was the healthiest it had been in years. One evening in late May, as they were walking back from checking on the new calf, Maggie suddenly stopped walking. Tex? Yeah? I tore up the letter. He stopped too, turning to face her. The one from your sister? I wrote her back and told her I wouldn't be coming to Boston. Why? Maggie looked around at the land they'd worked so hard to improve. The fence lines were straight and strong. The pastures were green and well managed. The barn and cabin were in better shape than they'd ever been, because this is mine too now. Not just yours, mine. We built this together, and I'm not walking away from something I helped create. Even though Boston would be easier, I don't want easier. I want this, she gestured around them. I want to see what we can build together, not what someone else already built without me. Tex felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. Are you sure? I'm sure. She smiled at him, and for the first time since their wedding day, it reached her eyes. Besides, someone has to keep you from making foolish decisions about the cattle. He laughed, surprised by how good it felt. Can't argue with that. As they walked back toward the cabin, their hands brushed, and for the first time, neither of them pulled away. It wasn't love yet, but it was something deeper than partnership and stronger than convenience. That night, as Maggie prepared for bed, she looked out the window at the ranch they'd transformed together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new projects. There would be difficult days ahead, and they still had a lot to learn about each other. But for the first time since leaving Ireland, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Not because someone else wanted her there, but because she had chosen to be there. And maybe, just maybe, that choice would grow into something even more beautiful than the life they'd already built together. Summer arrived with a burst of wildflowers across the prairie and the best grass Tex had seen in years. The cattle were fat and healthy, and their little ranch was finally turning a real profit. More importantly, the partnership between Tex and Maggie had grown into something neither of them had expected when they first shook hands in that dusty marriage bureau. It started with small moments that meant more than either of them said out loud. Tex bringing Maggie coffee while she worked in her garden, Maggie mending his favorite shirt without being asked, the way they moved around each other while doing chores, like dancers who had learned each other's steps. One morning in June, Tex was fixing a loose board on the barn when he heard Maggie singing as she gathered eggs from the chicken coop. It was an Irish song he didn't recognize, something lilting and sweet that seemed to match the morning breeze. He stopped hammering just to listen, and when she finished, he realized he was smiling. "That was beautiful," he called over. She looked up, surprised. "You heard that?" "Hard not to." "You've got a lovely voice." A blush crept up her cheeks. "My mother used to sing that song while she worked, said it made the chores go faster." "Sing it again sometime? Maybe I will." That evening, as they sat on the porch after supper, Maggie hummed the tune softly while they watched the stars come out. Tex found himself thinking that this quiet contentment was better than any excitement he'd ever known. Their success wasn't going unnoticed by their neighbors either. Other ranchers started stopping by, asking for advice about cattle management and pasture rotation. They always addressed their questions to Tex, but he made sure to include Maggie in the conversations. "My wife had the idea about dividing the grazing areas," he'd say. "She's got a good head for this kind of thing." At first, some of the older ranchers seemed surprised to hear a woman's opinions taken seriously. But when they saw the results on the McCready Ranch, they started listening more carefully to what Maggie had to say. "Never seen cattle look so good," declared Frank Morrison, whose spread was twice the size of theirs but half as productive. "Maybe I should get myself one of them Irish wives?" "Just the one wife is plenty for me," Tex said, catching Maggie's eye across the yard. "But you're welcome to try her rotation grazing system." By midsummer, their ranch had become something of a model for the area. They had the healthiest cattle, the best maintained property, and a reputation for innovation that brought visitors from as far as 3 counties away. More importantly to Tex, he and Maggie had found a rhythm together that felt as natural as breathing. They worked side by side all day, planned improvements over supper, and talked late into the evenings about everything from cattle prices to childhood memories. One hot July afternoon, as they were moving cattle to a fresh pasture, Maggie suddenly stopped and put her hand to her stomach. "You all right?" Tex asked, immediately concerned. "I'm fine. Just felt a little dizzy for a moment." But over the next few weeks, Tex noticed other things. Maggie was tired more often, and some mornings she couldn't keep her breakfast down. She tried to hide it, but he'd been watching her too closely not to notice. Finally, one evening when she excused herself from the table looking pale, he couldn't keep quiet anymore. "Maggie, are you sick? Should I ride to town for the doctor?" She was quiet for a long moment, then sat back down at the table. "I don't think a doctor can help with this particular condition." "What do you mean?" I think I'm going to have a baby." The words hung in the air between them. Tex felt like someone had knocked the wind out of him, but not in a bad way. A baby. Their baby. "Are you sure?" "I've been keeping track and—" She gestured vaguely at her stomach. "All the signs are there." Tex stared at her, trying to process this news. When they'd gotten married, children had never been part of their practical arrangement. Now, suddenly they were going to be a real family. "How do you feel about it?" he asked carefully. "Scared," she admitted, excited. "Worried about how we'll manage with a baby on the ranch. Happy." She looked at him with those green eyes that had become so dear to him. "How do you feel about it?" "All of those things," he said honestly. "Plus amazed." "Amazed?" "That something so good could come from 2 people who were just trying to survive." They talked late into the night about the baby, about their fears and hopes. Tex worried about providing for a family, about keeping Maggie and the baby safe in such an isolated place. Maggie worried about being a good mother, about how a baby would change their partnership. "I don't want to stop being useful to the ranch," she said. "I don't want to become just someone who stays in the house with the baby." "You'll always be my partner," Tex assured her. baby or no baby. We'll figure out how to make it work. As autumn approached and Maggie's pregnancy became more obvious, their neighbors rallied around them with advice, hand-me-down baby clothes, and offers of help. Old Pete's wife started stopping by weekly to check on Maggie and share stories about her own childbearing years. "First baby's always the scariest," she told Maggie one afternoon as they sat shelling peas. "But you're strong and you've got a good man who loves you." "I think he does," Maggie said quietly. "We've never actually said it, though. Some men show love better than they say it. Look how he treats you. Look how he talks about you to other folks. That man's as proud of you as any rooster in a henhouse." That evening, as they prepared for winter and the coming baby, Tex and Maggie were in the barn checking their hay stores when she brought up what Pete's wife had said. "Do you love me, Tex?" The question was simple, but Tex could hear the weight behind it. This wasn't just about words, it was about what they meant to each other, what they'd built together, what they wanted their future to look like. "Yes," he said, setting down the pitchfork he'd been holding. "I do love you, Maggie. I love your stubborn streak and your good sense. I love how you make me want to be better than I am. I love that you chose to stay here with me when you could. Have had an easier life somewhere else?" She smiled, and he could see tears in her eyes. "I love you too. I love that you learned to listen to me. I love that you're proud of what we've built together. I love that you make me feel like I belong somewhere." They kissed then, really kissed, for the first time since their wedding day. It tasted like promise and hope, and the kind of love that grows slowly but runs deep. The baby came in early December, during a gentle snowfall that seemed to bless their little family. It was a girl with Tex's dark hair and Maggie's green eyes. And when the midwife placed her in Maggie's arms, both parents knew their lives had changed forever. 2 weeks later, when Maggie's sister finally arrived from Boston for a long-promised visit, she found a scene that amazed her. The ranch was prosperous and well-run. The house was warm and welcoming. Most importantly, her sister was glowing with happiness as she showed off her baby and her husband with equal pride. "I was so worried about you," her sister confessed as they sat by the fire with baby Catherine sleeping between them. "When you wrote that you were staying, I thought you were making a mistake. I thought you were settling for less than you deserved." "I thought so too at first," Maggie admitted. "But it turns out I wasn't settling, I was choosing. There's a big difference." Outside, Tex was doing the evening chores, and through the window they could see him talking to the cattle like old friends, checking each animal with the careful attention he brought to everything he loved. "He's a good man," her sister observed. "The best. And we're good together. We make each other stronger." As winter settled over the ranch, the little family found their rhythm. Tex would bring the baby out to the barn sometimes while Maggie worked on ranch bookkeeping. Maggie would strap Catherine to her chest and help with lighter chores when the weather allowed. They adapted their partnership to include their daughter, just as they'd learned to adapt everything else to work for both of them. One evening, as they sat by the fire with baby Catherine asleep in her cradle, Tex looked around their small cabin and marveled at how full it felt. Not with things, but with contentment and love and the satisfaction of building something good together. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked Maggie. "Marrying someone you didn't know? Coming to this rough place?" She looked at him over their sleeping. Daughter, this man who had become so much more than the practical arrangement they'd started with. "Never," she said firmly. "Best decision I ever made was becoming the bride nobody else wanted. Because it led me to the life I never knew I wanted, with the man I never expected to love." Outside, the wind was gentle, and their cattle were safe. And warm, inside, their little family was complete and happy. They had built something beautiful from the most practical beginnings, proving that sometimes the strongest love grows not from passion, but from partnership, respect, and the courage to see the best in each other.